I bet you're crazy excited to get out on the water this spring, but all that hope is going to be dashed against the rocks of reality when you run into one of fly fishing's toughest obstacles, the early season hatch. When the first big hatches of the year start popping, the fish don't just gorge themselves silly. No, they're pickier than a toddler at dinner time and just as unpredictable. In my 20 years of fly fishing, I can't tell you how many times I've had my butt absolutely kicked during these spring hatches. But some of the best days I've ever had on the water happened this time of year. This week on Untangled, I'm going to share everything I've learned from both my successes and my failures so you can go out and have an unforgettable day of spring fly fishing. This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Co. Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled and I'm your host, Spencer Durant. Hope you're doing freaking fantastic today, by the way, wherever you're listening to this show from. We've got 8 tips for you that we're going to go over that will help you have one of those unforgettable days on the water this spring. We won't be covering the flies to use in this episode. We covered all of the spring flies in episode 117. I cover the sizes, exactly which patterns to use, and then I tell you why I like those patterns so much. So if you haven't listened to that episode yet, I will drop a link to that in the show notes. You can check it out once we're done here, because all we're focusing on today is the how. How do you actually go out and not get your butt kicked during one of these spring hatches? So let's dive into it. Like I said, I've got 8 tips, and these aren't in any specific order. It's just the order they came to me as I was putting the show together. And our first one is going to be all about our blue-winged olives. So the blue-winged olives, they're a little mayfly. They are the star of the show when it comes to spring hatches. You mention a blue-winged olive and the fish really perk up. At least I think they perk up. I think it makes them happy to see the blue wings. There's no way to really know if a fish is happy, but I don't know. They've been eating scuds and midges and sow bugs and worms all winter. I think they're grateful for the variety that the blue wings are when they start hatching. But they really do perk up. They're kind of, you mentioned wings around me at all, you got my attention instantly. I'm zeroed in on that. I think that's how the trout react to the blue wings. They come in and boom, the trout are keyed in on them. So they are the main star of the show when it comes to our spring hatches. In later spring, though, you are going to get some caddis hatches. You've got the famous Mother's Day caddis hatch that comes off on the Madison and other rivers out there in Montana. And then in some places, you'll even get a squala stonefly hatch. Sometimes around in March, maybe sometimes in April. Those will come off as well. And then, of course, midges are going to continuously hatch during the spring because midges hatch year-round. They're very dependable like that. But with the blue wing hatch in particular, if you want to get out and get into some of this blue wing fishing, because it really can be. I shared a story last week about this where the blue wing hatches can just be ridiculous and the fish really can lose a lot of their inhibition and you can catch a lot of big ones on them. If you want to get into that kind of fishing, I cannot stress enough just how important it is to watch the weather, because the weather is going to impact the blue wing hatches more than just about anything else. Now, blue wings are still going to hatch when it's sunny and bright and nice out. I was on the water just last week. Alex and I we saw some blue wings. We even watched a few trout eat them, and I think it was the very last day of February when we saw that happen. So it was a little early, but it was really cool. But the blue wings are going to come off in the biggest numbers when the weather is overcast and if you've got a slight drizzle. The blue wings love that. Too much rain is going to put the bugs down. If it's too cold, the hatch really won't pop either. Generally, I like my temps to be about 32 degrees in freedom units for a good blue wing hatch. And then if it gets really windy, because it will blow a lot during spring, it'll blow all the duns right off the water, and the fish won't be eating off the top near as much, which can be a little frustrating. So you do need a perfect storm of bugs coming off if you want to catch them on top. And I mean, yeah, you could nymph, and you'll still catch them on blue wing nymphs, but come on, we nymphed all winter long. It's time for some dry fly fishing, am I right? And then again, midges are going to be your other constant during spring hatches. They will come off whenever. In fact, I was out on the water yesterday and there were a bunch. They were hatching everywhere. There were literally clouds of them. Some of them flew up my nose. I think I swallowed a couple, but it was so bright and sunny that the fish weren't up feeding on them. The overcast days, I think, make the fish feel a little safer. And then again, when you combine the fish feeling a little safer to rise with the fact that the overcast days bring out the thickest hatch, the fish are going to lose a lot of their natural wariness and just eat off the top as much as they can when there's that much food in the water. So it really is this perfect storm. But if it's bright and sunny, the hatch isn't as good. Plus, the fish are a little scared, so they're going to hunker down. Because again, the water's still low and clear during spring. It really hasn't started to pop up yet, so the fish are still going to be a little wary of rising too much because that's how they stay alive. They've got to have those natural instincts. Even with these big hatches in the spring, the fish aren't in the riffles quite yet. They're going to be in those deeper pools and runs. It's really not going to be until later spring, early summer that you'll see that big transition of fish into the riffles. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, when I talk about riffles, runs, or pools, or anything else like that, we've actually got a free ebook all about reading water and how to find fish. I'll throw a link to that in the show notes for you. So that's tip number 1. Tip number 2 is all about reading water, taking a look at where the fish are at. So during winter, fish are stuck in those deep pools and the deep, slow runs, just like I mentioned. They're not moving around a whole lot because the water's so cold that the bugs aren't very active, and a fish's metabolism slows down a lot in cold water as well. Now, we get into spring, it's a time of transition. The water is getting warmer, but it's still cold. It's not up to that ideal temp range of like the high 40s, low 50s when trout are really happy about it. Again, fish will move from those deeper pools, but you're not going to find them in the riffles unless the hatch is just outrageously good and the fish are just moving into them because they can. Or if you get into that later spring caddis hatch, you will see the fish move into the riffles at that point. Because even with the mayflies and the midges hatching, that's a lot of food. That's still not enough to make it worth the energy for the fish to live in a riffle compared to the run. Because again, that water's cold and metabolism is slowed down. They're still trying to conserve energy as much as they can. All right. Runs and pools are going to be the ticket. That's where you want to focus your efforts, but they are going to move higher up in the water column in both. During the winter, they're all the way down at the bottom. They're just hunkered down. But during the spring, they will start to rise up in the water column a little bit, and you don't need to be down as deep consistently to get into fish. In fact, just last week, when Alex and I were out, we floated the green with a buddy of mine, and all of the fish that we saw were in either the really deep pools, and we actually got some cool GoPro footage of this. I'll have to see if I can snag it and throw it in the video. But they were either in the really deep pools or they were at the tailouts of the deep pools. So they were in a little bit shallower water, but we were starting to see them move just a little bit out of the really deep stuff into the tailouts. That's a great place for fish to hang out because the food's whizzing by, it can't escape, and the fish can just feed on it pretty well. So you will start to see that movement. Spring's a time of transition, but they're not going to be in the riffles quite yet. So let's move on to tip number 3, which is all about fish activity. And I'll tell you, I got to learn a thing or two from fish about activity because after this really long winter, I got some wing weight that I got to work off so I look good in all our spring videos that we're doing. But anyways, the fish during spring are going to be most active when the hatches are popping off. Now, we see that trend year round, but it is very pronounced during the spring because in the summer, you can reliably catch fish just about all day long. Yes, the fishing will be better early in the morning and late at night when the hatches are coming off. But during the spring, that becomes even more pronounced. And to illustrate this point, I'll tell y'all a little story about some fishing I had last spring. is out on a river here, big freestone. And I think I took Alex there, and then I went back a couple of days later because the fishing was so good. I had to go back. So I blew off work. I drove over there and set up shop. And I get down to fishing, get down to the river, and there's midges just coming off everywhere. There were even a few little black stoneflies that were buzzing around still. And I started out nymphing because the fish weren't up rising on anything yet. And the fishing was just lights out. It was to the point, I'm sure it wasn't this way, but looking back on it, it felt like every single drift I was getting a fish. It was that kind of fishing. I don't know if it actually was that good, but that's how it felt. So it's going fast and furious. The fish start rising. I throw on a little Adams and I actually start catching fish off the top. And this was in mid-March. So I was really excited to be fishing dry flies. And then the hatch started to taper off and the fishing just nosedived after that. Even the nymphing, it wasn't as good as it was. I still caught a few, but it was very noticeable that I got there, the hatch was happening, the fishing was fantastic. And then as soon as that hatch died, the fishing just slowed down and it felt like winter fishing again all over. So when the hatch isn't going, the fish really can almost revert back to that winter behavior and just kind of sulk around and not do much. So tip number 4 is something that we teach here at VFC all the time. It's one of our key skills, and that is you've got to watch and wait. You don't just start throwing your flies all willy-nilly out there when you see a hatch going and the fish rising, because again, these fish are toddlers. They are picky. They're going to throw tantrums, and you've got to be able to observe before you start fishing so you have a better plan of attack. It's kind of like when I get a big old plate of wings in front of me, I don't just dig into it immediately. I take a minute to appreciate it first off, because that's just art. A big plate of wings is beautiful, but then you've also got to figure out how you're going to eat the dadgum thing. Well, same thing here, same concept here. You really want to pay attention to what the fish are doing before you start making your casts. A really good friend of mine, his name is Ryan Kelly. He used to guide on the green, and he is one of the most, if not the most knowledgeable person I know when it comes to spring fishing. He just has that stuff dialed. Now, on his river, on the green, the midges will hatch, and it will be so thick, it looks like floating rafts of midges just drifting down the river. He's actually got videos on his Instagram account of fish literally rising in the middle of a pile of like hundreds of midges and just eating not one bug, but they're eating an entire mouthful of them all at once. And if a blue wing hatch gets that thick, the fish will do the same thing. You'll see it. They'll eat just a whole bunch. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. If they can come up and eat 5 or 6 bugs with one rise, then why wouldn't they do that? You know, maximum reward for the minimum amount of energy expended. That's what fish are all about. Now, to that end, Ryan actually ties and fishes a size 6 Griffith's gnat. Yes, you heard that correctly. Size 6 Griffith's gnat to imitate these giant midge clusters. And last week when he and I were fishing together, he just casually asked me, because we saw a little midge hatch coming off in the afternoon. He's like, "Hey, do you have any size 6 Griffith's gnats? That'll work really well right now." And I just looked at him like, "Excuse me? What? A size 6 Griffith's gnat? Are you kidding me?" I'd never heard it before. But the point here is, yes, you've got to watch and wait. You've got to observe, but it really pays to identify, especially in the spring, if the fish are eating single flies or if they're eating mouthfuls of them. If they're eating single flies, then you just want to tie on a good representation of that. A mat midge for the midges is a great pattern to use. And then obviously, blue-winged olive cripples or duns are going to work great for the BWOs. But then if the fish are eating mouthfuls of them, if they're just coming up and going to town, then you can go with a big midge cluster pattern. Or even a renegade, honestly, if you want to go old school. That's a cool little fly. Doesn't get enough love anymore, I think. If they're eating a lot of blue wings all at once, I've had a lot of success just tossing a larger purple haze out there in the middle of the real blue-winged olives. And if all the blue-winged olives are like a size 16, then I'll go to one size up. So I'll throw a size 14 purple haze out there, and it'll actually do pretty well with that little technique. And then it's also important to pay attention to what the fish are eating, because two hatches can come off at once. They can coincide, and one can act as what you might hear referred to as a masking hatch. Okay, that just means two hatches are coming off, and you think the fish are eating one, but they're actually eating the other because maybe you didn't even see that other bug hatching. Okay, when blue wings and midges are hatching together, I think it's very natural for us to assume that the fish are eating the blue wings because the blue wings are bigger. They're more food. So you think that's what the fish would eat. But sometimes they don't. They're eating the midges, and you're sitting there fishing a blue wing, not catching anything, and you're frustrated as all get out. That happened to Alex and I last spring. Actually, we were on the Beaverhead in Montana, and we got to the water, and I think within 5 minutes of parking the truck, we saw a fish rise. And there were blue wings, and we just tied blue wings on. We didn't take any time to watch and wait. We just tied blue wings on, and for 2 hours we fished blue wings and did not catch anything. And then it wasn't until Alex finally put a midge on that he's like, "Oh, dude, there's midges hatching too, and yeah, we need to tie a midge on." So we did, caught a whole bunch of fish. So definitely make sure you're paying attention to what the fish are eating. It's going to pay off for you in the long run. All right, tip number 5. I don't say this very often, and this is one of the few times of the year that I think it actually matters, but tippet size does matter during the spring. This is the only time of year, other than maybe late fall, that I go small on my tippet. I will break out the 6X because the water can be so low and clear during the spring that you just need to get a softer, more delicate presentation. Sometimes that's not even enough, though. Sometimes there's just nothing you can do. Last week when I was out with Alex and Ryan, we had this beautiful fish rising, and I made, after a lot of bad casts, I finally made one good cast, and the fish came up, and you could watch, he went almost vertical under the fly, and he was ready to open his mouth and eat, and then he just didn't. He just didn't eat it. He did everything except eat the fly. And I'd gone light on the tippet. The fly was a good match. The cast was good, but there was just something about it that he just didn't like. So it really can matter at that point. I will also significantly lengthen my leader this time of year as well, because I want to get a longer drag-free drift. And then your longer leaders can land a little softer than a shorter leader. That's going to matter in the low, clear water where the fish are extra spooky. So a typical spring leader for me when the fish are being extra picky. Now, I don't start off with this leader. I default to my 9-foot. In the spring, I'll do 5X, but I default to my 9-foot leader, and then I only build it out longer if the fish are being picky and if the situation demands it. So when I do build it out longer, I'll actually start with a 9-foot 4X leader. I like to use a little thicker base leader because it's a little heavier, turns these tiny flies over just a little bit better, especially if you've got any wind kicking up. Then off of that 4X leader, I'll tie about 2 feet of 5X and then another 2 feet of 6X, connect all that with blood knots. So I end up with about a 13-foot leader, which is kind of long. It's a little bit of a pain in the butt to cast, but it really makes a difference during those spring hatches because it'll just roll out and just land very, very softly. The first time I ever saw this work for me, and that I became a convert to this style leader for the spring, was years ago out in Oregon with my buddy Ryan McCullough. I've got a lot of buddies named Ryan. My buddy Ryan and I were fishing, and we got to this little bend in the river, and there was a fish rising tight up against this big bank of moss. And when I say tied up against it, I mean his nose was touching the moss every time he'd come up to rise. And there was another bank of moss maybe a foot away from that. So he's rising in this 12-inch wide channel. And there was kind of a tricky current in there. And the water was low, crystal clear, just typical spring conditions. And it was the sort of thing where you look at it and you understand you've got one cast to pull this off. And if you do it, it's going to be amazing. And you're going to look like you know what you're doing. But if you mess it up, you're going to spook that fish and not catch him. And on top of that, water's low and clear enough that both Ryan and I could see that it was a pretty sizable brown trout. We were very excited to catch it. Now, I thought Ryan was going to make the cast. We were taking turns as we fished upriver, and it was his turn. But he turns to me, he hands me his rod, and he says, "You do it." And I look at him, and I say, "Ryan, you're out of your dadgum mind. I'm going to mess this cast up." He says, "Nope, you do it." So I take his rod, and I knew I had one shot to do this. And he had a 13, 14-foot leader on, a 6X tippet, small fly, just like I described. I make the cast. I land it. And when I tell you, it's that picture perfect, the leader just rolls out in this beautiful arc and just, the fly just kisses the water like a butterfly with sore feet, drifts right into that brown trout. Brown trout comes up, eats it. I didn't mess up the hook set, which I was convinced I was going to do. When I realized I did the cast, I was convinced the hook set was going to be messed up. And I landed it, and I think it ended up being about a 20, 21-inch brown trout. Just so memorable because it was a one-shot cast, and I didn't screw it up. But I credit a lot of that to the leader playing such an important role. So there are times when that's going to matter. Now let's move on to tip number 6. Fly selection. Fly selection can be just a bear this time of year. It can be really tough. The fish are eating all sorts of life cycle stages of the bugs, and it's up to you as the angler to decode what it is they're eating. Now, if you're not familiar with the bug life cycle stages, a lot of your aquatic insects, they start out their life as a larva or a pupa underneath the water, and then they're going to turn into an adult on top of the water with wings. We call that a dun. But in between, there's an emerger stage. And that emerger stage, they're transforming from the nymph into the dun, and they're shooting up through the water, and then they get stuck in the surface film. They're trying to dry their wings out, get ready to fly away. And the fish can be eating those, or they can be eating the dead ones that have already mated. We call those spent wings or spinners. So there's a lot of different types of the same bug that they can be eating. And as much as we want to fish dries, as much as we want to fish dries, sometimes you will have a ton of luck fishing an unweighted nymph, like on a 12 to 16-inch dropper this time of year, because the fish can be chilling just below the surface, eating nymphs, completely uninterested in the duns because they're just eating those emergers as they're shooting up through the water column. An unweighted nymph like a pheasant tail, or even if you tie one with a glass bead, because glass is a lot lighter than brass or tungsten, can sink just enough to get to where the fish are eating, and you can start hauling in fish just hand over fist, if you know what you're doing there. So being willing to say, all right, there's a bunch of bugs on the water, the fish aren't really keyed in on them, you're not seeing consistent rises, that might mean they're just underneath the water a little bit, snacking on the nymphs and the emergers that are shooting up through the water column. A few years ago, this happened to me. I was out on the lower Provo River back when I lived in Utah. Beautiful blue wing hatch. I was in college at the time. I skipped class to go to this blue wing hatch. And I get there and tons of bugs on the water, not very many fish rising. So I tied on a little unweighted pheasant tail underneath my parachute blue wing, and it was lights out for like 2 hours. I caught almost every fish on that little pheasant tail because not only could I see them barely eating off the surface, so I knew they were probably eating nymphs, I could see them in some places eating right under the water. So it paid, again, I paid attention when I made that. I watched and waited, just like we talked about. But I was willing to say, all right, I'll fish a dry dropper instead of just fishing dries. So it does pay to get a little creative with your fly selection this time of year. Now, tip number 7, this goes right along with fly selection. Don't get too crazy. Don't get too off the wall with fly selection just yet. It's still very important to imitate what the fish are seeing. You want to make sure you're getting into that game. But feel free to use a size up to make your bugs stand out. Like I mentioned earlier, during those really thick blue wing hatches, you can throw on a slightly larger mayfly and sometimes make your bugs stand out. That really can work. And then last week, I think it was last week when Alex and I were out last, there were a lot of blue wings coming off, and there were some midges, and I was fishing really tiny nymphs, and I wasn't getting anything. And we fished this run for like 45 minutes, and Alex was having kind of a tougher time. And then he just put on a bigger pheasant tail, just a bigger blue wing nymph, basically, and drifts it through, and he caught 6-7 fish back to back to back because he was willing to just go ahead and use a little bit bigger fly. So don't get too off the wall with your fly selection. Go up in sizes, experiment a little bit. Also, don't be afraid to use eggs this time of year because you will get some fish that are spawning in the spring. So eggs are going to be present in the water. It's always good to have a few on hand. Just make sure that you're not fishing to fish that are actively spawning. And tip number 8, the last one, don't overlook the streamer game. It's incredibly important, especially if it rains or you get some snow melt that causes the water to get really high and dirty. All that extra water dumping in can move around a lot of the smaller fish, some of the bait fish, the sculpin, the shiners, whatever you've got in your rivers, and that can really trigger the predatory instincts in the trout. Even just dead drifting a streamer sometimes during the spring can be fantastic when the water conditions are like this. Probably 7 or 8 years ago, I was out back when I lived in Utah, and I was fishing this stream that was very off color. It was almost too off color to fish. It was high, and there were a bunch of fish in there that were spawning. So I was fishing behind the spawning reds, left the spawners alone, and I was fishing some eggs and catching the fish that weren't spawning. And I eventually switched it up to just a big, meaty streamer because it looked just like such good streamer water. The water was off color, and I was alternating between dead drifting it and stripping it. And I was dead drifting it through this one run, and my indicator just stopped, just completely stopped. And I set the hook, and it felt like I just set right into a log. And I thought, oh, great, I'm going to lose this fly. This is like a $7 fly. So I just started yanking on it, just hauling on it, trying to get it out. And then that log jumped out of the water, and it was one of the biggest cutthroat trout I've ever seen in my life. And that thing took off. It was one of the most incredible fights ever. I was in this little stream that actually dumps into a lake about a quarter mile away, and that fish ran all the way back to the lake. And then when it got into the lake, it ran me to backing. I ruined a pair of waders following this fish through the river. I slipped and fell and tore them up. And I eventually landed it. It was a beautiful 26-inch cutthroat trout, but it took that dead drifted streamer. So sometimes there is value in just throwing on the little bit bigger fly and experimenting with it, especially when the water conditions call for it. Now, I know that's a lot of information to take in, those 8 tips are, so don't be afraid to play this part of the show back if you need to, but all of these tips are built on the foundations that we teach here at VFC. Put your fly in front of fish, make it look real. The fish are going to make you work extra hard this time of year to know what type of fly to use and how to get it in front of them. But everything we talked about boils down to that concept. That's what I love about fly fishing. It really is simple when you boil it down. So if you get overwhelmed this spring, take a step back and just think about these 3 basics. Okay, fish activity is greatest during the hatches. Focus on fishing during the hatches, which is going to happen during the warmest part of the day. Cloudy, overcast weather with little wind, and a little drizzle are the best days for blue-winged olive hatches. And I think midge hatches are best then as well. And then make sure you're watching and waiting before you start fishing. Observe that fish behavior. It's going to give you a better idea of what the fish are eating and how they're eating it. And as always, if you've got any questions about anything we discussed here, please feel free to comment. Let me know. I'm more willing to explain it. But we are going to move on to the Q&A section of this week's show.
Anglers are always asking, what bugs are hatching right now? And that's why we put together a year-round hatch chart. It outlines all the major bug hatches so you always know what fly to tie on, no matter where you're fishing or what time of the year. So if you want to level up your skills and start catching more fish, click or tap the link in the show notes to get this free hatch chart. All right, back to the show.
Every week, we spend half the show directly answering questions from viewers and listeners just like yourself, and often the questions y'all send in become the basis for the opener of the show as well. So if you've got a question about fly fishing that you would like answered, please send it in. I love to get your questions, read them. It's great to see what y'all are thinking and how we can help y'all out. There's a link to send your questions in the show notes. And the first question this week comes to us from Andy from Nevada, who writes in and says, how do you keep a nymph or double nymph rig from constantly catching bottom? I understand depth management and use of indicators or the option to Euro nymph with a tight line, but is there a good method to simply fish with a single or double nymph rig and prevent bottom snagging as much as possible? Thank you. Andy, it's a good question. Thanks for sending it in. I want to answer your question first by doing a quick review of nymphing. What's the goal with nymphing? What are we trying to accomplish? Well, we want to get our flies in front of fish. We want to make them look real. That's our goal with everything. But with nymphs in particular, we're trying to get those flies down to the place the fish are most likely to hang out. Because if they're not eating off the top of the river during an active hatch, where are they most likely going to hang out? Well, they're going to chill on the bottom of the river. They do this because the current is moving a lot slower on the bottom of a river, so they're spending less energy to hang out there. And then on top of that, there's a whole bunch of food down there. You turn over a rock, you see how many bugs are underneath it. The rocks are on the bottom of the river. The fish can hang out. They can eat. They're just chilling. So they're going to be down lower. Okay. They can also, they just have so much food down there to choose from that they really are only going to go up to the top when there's a big hatch. Because when that hatch happens, you get a ton of biomass in the river, and that's just a majority of the prey organisms for trout. That's what your biomass is, because that biomass moves from the bottom of the river to the top. So the fish are going to follow that biomass as it moves, because again, it's easy food. Fish want the easy food. When nothing's hatching, they're going to follow that biomass down to the bottom of the river because that's where it's going to hang out. So you want your flies in the bottom third of the water column. That's the goal with nymphing. That puts your nymphs in front of all the fish that are hanging out on the bottom of the river, and they don't have to do very much to go eat your flies. Now, the way that you know you're deep enough that you're in the bottom third is that you're hanging up on the bottom every 4 or 5 casts or so. That's my personal benchmark. I know if I'm hanging up every 4 or 5 casts that I'm right about where I need to be depth-wise. If I'm snagging bottom every cast, I'm too deep. So at that point, I'll move my indicator down like an inch or two, just barely, because I want those flies just skimming, just gliding along the bottom. That's how you want to envision them moving. But ideally, again, you want to be hitting bottom because it means that your flies are down there in the strike zone. If you're never hitting bottom, you're probably not deep enough. Just yesterday, I was out on the water. I got to this little run, and my first cast hung up on the bottom. So I got it out. I cleaned the moss. I threw another cast, and that cast got stuck on a rock. So that told me I was just a bit too deep. So I moved my indicator, literally moved it 3 inches down my leader. So that shortens the amount of drop that I've got between my indicator and my flies. So they're going to ride a little bit higher in the water column. And on my next cast, I hooked into a 16-inch rainbow trout. It was literally 3 casts, 2 snags, adjusted the indicator, next cast, fish. If I hadn't been catching bottom frequently, I wouldn't have known to make that tiny adjustment, and I probably wouldn't have caught the fish. I would have gotten home skunked. So you probably... It might help to reframe a little bit how you think about this concept of nymphing, because you've got to realize that snagging bottom is feedback. That's telling you something about where your flies are. That's telling you where your rig is. And you're going to use that feedback to help make sure you get your flies in the strike zone. At that point, you just got to make some really minor adjustments to dial it in. So hopefully that helps. And thanks for sending the question in. T from Utah has our next question, writes in and says, well, first off, Spencer, y'all deserve some wings because you helped me catch my first fish and many others on a fly rod, so big thanks to y'all. Second, I was up in Wyoming fishing and I was catching a bunch of fish at the lake we were camping by with my fly rod. Later that afternoon, I tried to fish the stream by our campsite. I found a nice little spot where I knew fish would be. I tied on a double dry fly rig and proceeded to fish. Not even 10 seconds into it, I had a fish go for one of my flies. I set the hook and it popped right out. So I proceeded to do this for the next 2 hours, but each time the fish would spit the hook instantly or he would miss the fly when he would strike it. I tried waiting before setting the hook, setting it as soon as one grabbed it, and everything in between. This probably happened about 40 times more with fish before I headed back to camp with no fish caught. The next morning, the same thing happened. What did I do wrong? I tried to change my rig to a dry dropper, threw a streamer on, and lots of other things, but nothing worked. I thought maybe I just wasn't setting the hook right, but earlier that day I had caught around 25 fish at the lake, so I don't think so. Anyways, just thought I could get some advice from you or see if you've had anything like this happen to you. Thanks again for all y'all do and the great advice you give. Tight lines. That's awesome that you caught some fish, man. Congrats. Really good work there. Two things come to mind with this situation. Yes, I've been in it. I've been in this situation a lot. But the first thing that comes to mind is what I think is most likely. Since you said that you were catching fish on the lake earlier in the day, I don't think that your hook set technique is the problem, because if you were having major issues setting the hook, you probably wouldn't have done very well on the lake. So I don't think you need to worry about your hook setting technique. It sounds to me like the fish in the creek were just tiny, like 2 or 3 inches tiny. The small fish, when they get that tiny, they'll miss flies all the time. They'll come up and go for it, and they just miss it. They're not fully developed yet when they're that tiny, so they're not as good a predator. But then on top of that, their mouths are tiny, so they can't get their mouth all the way around the fly. Sometimes I have the luxury of watching all of the close-up videos of rising fish that we shoot here at VFC. And with the little fish, you'll literally see them come up and their nose will bump the fly out of the way sometimes. They get so excited. Or they'll open their mouth. And when they open their mouth, the hackle or the tail feathers on your fly will catch their teeth and it'll bump the fly out of the way because their mouth just isn't big enough to swallow the whole thing. So when that's going on, the workaround is to put on a smaller fly. And I don't know if you did that or not. You said you switched flies around, but I don't know if you put on a smaller one. So if you were out fishing, let's say you were fishing at like a size 10 chubby, Chernobyl or whatnot, I would go down significantly in size. I'd drop down to like a 16 or an 18, get down to a smaller dry and give those fish a chance to actually get it in their mouths. But usually when I run into a situation like this, it's because the fish are literally 2 to 3 inches long and they're trying to eat my fly. And it's just tough to catch those tiny, tiny fish. The other potential problem is something that I was recently reminded I do way too much. And that is when you set the hook, if you're excited, you're catching fish. Of course you're excited. This is one of the funnest daggum things you can do on the whole planet. Of course you're excited about it. But if you get too excited, a lot of anglers tend to not just move their arm for the hook set like you should, but they'll move their entire body. Now, I said I was reminded of this recently. Well, last week with Ryan Kelly and my buddy Ryan Kelly and Alex, we were all out fishing together. I was fishing streamers, and I hadn't fished streamers in a long time. So I was having a lot of fun doing it, and I had this huge hit. Fish just came out of nowhere and smacked that streamer like it owed him money. And I got so excited that when I went to strip set, I stripped the line really hard, but I also yanked my entire body to the right. I twisted with my hips. And I did it so hard that I yanked the fly right out of the fish's mouth, and I missed the fish. So if you were frustrated with these fish or you were excited, there's a chance that you were moving or pulling with your entire body when trying to set the hook, which is going to make it even harder to get the hook into that tiny fish's mouth. So it's always good if you miss a few fish in a row to take a deep breath, kind of take a reset, look at what you've been doing, and then focus on good hook setting techniques. Just lift straight up with dry flies, just lift straight up with the rod, keep the line tight. That's the approach you want to take. That's how it's going to work out for you. Hopefully that helps. And if you've got any other questions, feel free to send them in. Thank you. Jesse from Colorado's got her next question. Writes in and says, "Hey Spencer, I am fairly new to fly fishing. This is my first year of really diving off the deep end into the sport. I've enjoyed listening to your podcast because it has helped me learn a few tips I would never have figured out as I am fully self-taught. I've been hitting the water 2 to 3 times a week on the major rivers around Colorado. Now, I want to focus on some smaller alpine streams. I've just purchased a 7-foot 3-weight fiberglass rod. I'm in the process of now setting up the reel for it, and I was wondering, when fishing small streams with a shorter rod, do you actually need backing? I'm only making casts about 15 to 20 feet at a time, and nothing in those smaller streams is going to run like a big brown would on the South Platte. I assume there's no way an 8 to 10 inch brook trout is going to take me all the way to backing, right? Just wondering if backing is actually necessary for such small stream fishing. Thanks for all you do. P.S. Coke Zero tastes like a disappointment. Add 1 Diet Coke for me." Jesse, good question. And I guess it's time I address the elephant in the room, because I had Coke Zero on the desk today. Now, it's only here because I ran out of Diet Coke. I have not had a chance to make another run to the store. And this Coke Zero was left over from the last time Alex was here, and I needed something. So it was better than nothing, but I agree with you. All right, backing. The whole idea behind it is twofold. So first off, it does give you that extra line in case a fish takes your entire fly line off a reel. Fly lines are often only 90 to 100 feet long, and sometimes fish can make bigger runs of that, especially if you're in a lake or if you're out in the salt water. It's rare to get into backing on trout in a river. I think I've only been to backing in river trout 2 or 3 times, but it's very helpful to have it when you need it. It's definitely something you want. But the second thing that backing does, and this is what's most helpful for your situation, is it actually increases the arbor size of your reel. The arbor, that's just the diameter of the part of the reel that you wind your line around. So backing makes that arbor larger, which increases how much line you retrieve with a single revolution of your reel. So essentially, backing helps you reel in your line quicker, which can be helpful if you need to pick up line quickly and get a fish on the reel, or if you just want to reel in and move from spot to spot. Now, for the smaller fishing that you're talking about, yeah, backing just is overkill. You're not going to get into something that requires it, but it's also the best way to attach fly line to a reel as well. Fly line doesn't just attach itself to a reel. You attach the backing to the reel with a knot, and then you attach the backing to the fly line, and that's how it all stays together. If you didn't attach the fly line to the reel, if you just wound it around there, it would unwind and just turn into a giant mess. So you don't need a ton of backing, but you do need some, even on your little 2 or 3 weights. And often the place you buy your fly line from, they'll put backing on your reel for free so you can have them do it. It's really simple to add some yourself as well, but you definitely need some. I would say it's necessary. Just at a bare minimum, you want to be able to attach your fly line to the reel, so you're going to need your backing for that. A very good question. I appreciate you sending it in. And with that, folks, we're going to move on to the Live Your Life moment of this week's show. Every week, we end the show by sharing pictures and stories from folks who are out on the water living real life. We love to see and hear about your time out on the water. So if you've got a Live Your Life moment that you would like to share with us, you can go ahead and send those in at the link in the show notes. And this week's Live Your Life moment is from Brooke. Writes in and says, "I'm a 54 and just getting back into fly fishing after 30 years. This Saturday, I rode my enduro motorcycle for about an hour and arrived about daybreak to the river. It's summer, so I was wet wading. Water temp was about 48 to 50 degrees. I was told to start with a ruby midge for the best chance of catching a trout. I hooked the first one about 10 minutes in and let out an audible giggle and soon landed, photographed, and released my first rainbow. A friend of mine soon arrived after I landed the second one. He gave me a few pointers and made my casting much smoother. I stayed about 4 hours and caught 12 rainbows and lost 4 to 5 more. This was more of a confidence booster than I realized I needed. Being successful on the first solo trip to the river is one of my greatest joys." Brooke, that is awesome. Everything you're talking about here is really cool. Motorcycles, getting to the river early, catching your fish. That's fantastic. That's getting out there and enjoying it. That's what it's all about, isn't it? Thank you so much for sending that in. And with that, folks, we're going to wrap up the show this week. Just a reminder, we've got a ton of fantastic extra content that can help you out. So please click on the links wherever you see them. Go check out all the other stuff that we make so that you can have a great time on the water and live real life. And then if you could, just make sure you rate and subscribe to the show wherever you're listening to it. The more ratings and subscriptions we get means the more folks we can help live real life. And with that, get out on the water, enjoy some spring fishing, even though it's tough. And until next week, live real life.